657. Methodology and African prehistory. Laterization, in which oxides and carbonates that have infiltrated in solution as a result of rain or humidity are brought to the surface by capillary action, and then as a result of evaporation form a solid crust which becomes darker with age. Comparison with the natural rock should thus theoretically provide a basis for comparative dating, but there are numerous pitfalls. Everything depends on the consistency of the rock, on whether or not it has been exposed to sun and wind, and so on. This method of dating can at best give only relative results. Sometimes it is possible to estimate the age of a picture from the fauna depicted in it, since not all types lived in the same major periods. Bubaloos, for instance, is a very early species, now extinct and known only from its fossil remains. These animals could, however, quite well have been depicted as reminders of a bygone age. Nor, as we shall see, is style a reliable guide. Far from it. In the beginning, it is true, observation seems to have been what mattered most, and the result was a characteristics and naturalistic approach. In addition, Bubaloos carvings in the Sahara are in general earlier than the paintings. Buried artifacts bearing the same type of decoration as in the paintings are normally contemporary with them, but there is absolutely no universal rule about it. Another method sometimes used is relative dating on the basis of overlays, lines that obliterate other lines being the more recent. However, overlays are not by any means found everywhere, and the weathering of the rock and the fading of the pigments often make interpretation risky and contradictory. 3. There remains the radiocarbon method of dating, which of course is ideal, but it can only rarely be used, for the reasons mentioned above. One also has to be very cautious because paint debris could have been in contact with recent organic matter, or a charcoal fragment could have been the result of a fire caused by lightning. The number of such datings is nevertheless gradually growing. The white way of example, charcoal from a deep layer at mean yet wider in the central Sahara yielded a date of 5410 ± 300 BP. Politics may also become involved with dating. Thus Afrikaner observers are very loath to accept the very great age of Africa's indigenous artistic civilization, and tend to shorten its development by telescoping and or by mechanically applying methods of assessment used for European rock paintings. In this way, they put the Drakensberg paintings later than the 2. The shape of the groove in carvings degenerates in time, as a result of physical and chemical processes, from the original sharp V to a wide-mouthed V and then becomes flattened out, but these changes give only a very rough indication of age. 3. J.D. Lejeune, 1977, applied the latest photographic techniques to the paintings at At Tassili. Red figures appeared to have been painted over a greenish-brown masked woman, but this turned out not to be entirely so. The woman's white ornaments had in fact been added later, over the red figures. Australian rock paintings in China are commonly repainted to freshen them up, the Aborigines meanwhile telling legendary tales to conjure up rain. L. Frodenis also observed this practice among young people in Senegal. 658. African prehistoric art. 17th century, that is, long after the arrival of the Bantu. Even if we disregard the fact that some South African rock art depicts fortunate dates from much earlier in this area, it seems hardly likely that the San would have waited for their wars with the Bantu to develop an art form requiring at least a minimum of stability for its practice. We therefore need to re-examine the question of periods. If we are to fit prehistoric art finds into an intelligible time scale, our first approach must be geological and ecological, since the environment, for peoples without our technological adjuncts, was more of a constraint than it is today, and both provided and imposed the general framework of existence. The biotope in particular conditioned the life of the species represented, including man himself, his techniques and his styles. Although it is true, as J. Ruffy puts it, that man was originally a tropical animal from Africa, the temperate conditions in the north after the end of the Ice Ages enabled the colonization of Europe to take place, which culminated in the splendid flowering of rock art in underground galleries 40 centuries ago. African rock art is much later. Admittedly, some authors, such as E. Holm, consider that its origins go back to the Mesolithic, but in essence it dates from the Neolithic. For it has become customary to call the major periods of rock art by the name of an animal, which thus provides a typological reference point. For major series are thus named after the Bubaloos, the Odex, the horse and the camel. The Bubalus antiquus was a kind of enormous buffalo which, according to the paleontologists, dates from the beginning of the Quaternary. It is depicted from the beginning of rock art about 9000 BP to around the year 6000. This period is also characterized by elephants and 4. The Saharan Neolithic is being put further and further back into light of recent finds. The Neolithic pottery deposit in the Haggard has been radiocarbon dated to 8450 BP, which makes it virtually contemporary with Near Eastern Neolithic. See also the date suggested by D. Moldrop in Chapter 11 for the Newborn sites of Belana 12,050 BP and Totka 12,550 BP. The rock shelter at Ibn with paintings of oxen, has yielded food fragments. The earliest heart has been radiocarbon dated from 4860 plus 250 BP. In the Akakus Massif, Libya, F. Mori found a fragment of fallen wall between two layers containing remains of hearts, with painting dating from the OX period. The two layers having been dated, it materializes that the piece of wall goes back to 4730 BP. Ch. L. Hope, 1976, pages 102 and 109. The date of 70 for 50 BP has also been given for the Middle OX period at Akakus, cf. H. J. Hugot, 1974, page 274. J. D. Clark has likewise reported a date of 6310 plus minus 250 BP from Solwezi, Zambia. On the other hand, the date of 11,250 plus minus 400 BP given in J.T. Liu's thesis for the Mats Shelter Cape province is regarded as precarious. At the extraordinary site of Tanakaton, there are frescoes that can be correlated with a whole series of Neolithic and later levels containing skeletons, i.e. an easily datable human stratigraphy, even including an 80 on level C de Coubertin exceptional Otassoli, in Archaeologia, 94, MOY 1976, pages 28 and 59. 659. Methodology and African prehistory. Rhinoceroses. The ox is either Bos ibericus or Brachyceros with short, stout horns, or Bos africanus, with a magnificent lyre-shaped pair of horns. It appears around the year 6000 BP. The horse Equuscobalus, sometimes pulling the chariot, makes its appearance about the year 6000 B. Page 5. The flying gallop gait, whilst not realistic, is naturalistic on the western track from Morocco to the Sudan, whereas on the eastern road from the Pheasant 6 it is highly stylized. By now we are well into the period of history when the hippopotamus disappears from rock paintings, no doubt denoting the end of perennial water. The camel brings up the rear of this historical caravan. Introduced into Egypt by the Persian conquest about 500 before our era, it is COMMON at about the beginning of the Christian era. 7. For the purposes of prehistory, it is mainly the first two periods and the beginning of the horse period that are of interest to us here, since they cover the period of MXIMUM activity in the vast area that was later to become the Sahara Desert. Scholars obsessed with chronological divisions argue over the subperiods to be established within the main periods, but discoveries are still being made and we must not be in too much of a hurry to affix rigid labels to whole sections of what is after all a largely unknown past. It is more a case, so to speak, of very ill-defined animal dynasties in the iconography, with a great deal of overlapping. For example, the ram, classified as later than Bubalus, and the elephant, sometimes seems to be contemporary with them. It appears on the same walls, portrayed by the same techniques and showing the same pattern. Perhaps it was not yet domesticated, or kept in captivity for a religious purpose. Similarly, the great engraved oxen at Dibber, in the Tassili, one of which is over 5 meters tall, with great lyre-shaped horns incorporating a symbol, seem to be contemporary with Bubalus. Some scholars place the ox wearing a pendant that owed Gerat in the Bubalus period. Moreover, new animals increasingly appear on the scene, like the owls at Tantarit, some 40 of which coincide with the figures of oxen. For areas other than the Sahara, the major periods are often later in date. They are defined by different criteria which also vary from author to author, especially as authors sometimes base their division into periods on techniques, genres and styles. 8. 5. The arrival of the horse in Africa is too often linked with that of the Hyksos in Egypt. On this point see J. K. Serbo, 1978, page 99. 6. O. and the Chariot Roads Cr. Mani, 1961. 7. The camel nevertheless seems to have been known since the Pharaonic period. Cf. E. D. Musia, I. 960, pages 209-47. 8. In southern Africa, some authors distinguish two main periods on the basis of the shape of the groove: the attack technique, incision, hammering, wh obvious or other pies, polishing, and so on, and the fada depicted. The first main period comprises two stages, and the second four. 660. African prehistoric art. Techniques, genres and styles. Techniques. Engravings in general, where both exist. Engravings are earlier than paintings, and the best engraving technique is found in the earliest periods. Engraving was done in the softer sandstone rocks, and in granite and quartzite as well, by means of a sharpened stone struck with a Neolithic hammerstone, specimens of which have been found near the carvings. With only this minimal equipment, the precision of the technique is brilliant. The elephant at Baixado is delineated with a single light line. It is hardly more than a sketch, but it brings out the essentials. The elephants that in Galgi and Matherndas and in Hobbiter II, on the other hand, are deeply cut with a heavy lifelike line, and so is the rhinoceros at Gronotivasti. The groove is either V-shaped, or shaped like a U and taken down to a depth of about a centimeter. The notches were made either with a stone axe or piece of very hard wood, damp sand possibly being used as an abrasive. Sometimes there is a combination of techniques with, for instance, delicate use of the hammer plus severe shaped incision. Here and there, the preliminary marker holes have left traces of roughness at the bottom of the groove. The fine polishing was accompanied by light hammering. Making these engravings must sometimes have called for distinct athletic ability. At Gujarat, for instance, there is an elephant for 5 meters high, and the beginnings of the rhinoceros 7 to 5 meters long. In Central and Southern Africa, engravings with broadly incised outlines are thought to be associated with religious purposes, whilst delicately grooved engravings possibly denote an initiatory or instructional aim. Delicate effects are achieved by hollowing and highly polishing some surfaces between the outlines to represent the shades of animals' coats or their loads. This technique foreshadows the bas-reliefs of Pharaonic Egypt. Indeed, the figure is sometimes produced by engraving it entirely in intaglion, like a cameo. The natural rock is used very oppositely. For instance, a giraffe is carved on an oblong block of diabase whose shape it exactly fits Western Transvaal. Similarly, in the Fonte area, the rhinoceros is carved on a rock with a rough surface and angular ridges that precisely reproduce the animal's carapace. The Mareches Fonte Hill Western Transvaal aquata has been engraved and stippled on a piece of diabase. Its lower jaw coincides with a slight bulge in the stone which vividly represents the reality. In the Transvaal Museum there is a splendid image of a male antelope whose mane is rendered by dotted stripes, while its frontal tuft is represented by delicately incised lines. The colors of the interior of the rock blue and its surface red ochre are used to perfection to bring out the contrasts. Another masterpiece of prehistoric African stone engravers is the group of giraffes at Blade AA, with their spotted coats, their legs in such natural attitudes, and even 661. Methodology and African prehistory. Their waving tails. But technique tended on the whole to deteriorate. By the so-called OX period, carvings are already often mediocre as, for instance, in the case of the giraffes at El Greirabat, produced by coarse heavy stippling. Paintings these should not be considered in isolation from engravings. At Tsubkai, for instance, there are outlines sketched on the walls, suggesting that the artists first engraved and then painted. Here again, artistic work sometimes called for feats of athletic prowess. At Gujarat there is a horse period painting 8 to 5 meters long on a steeply sloping ceiling, and at some of the Taxili sites, such as Tsubkai, paintings begin nearly 4 meters from the ground, as though it was wished to avoid the lower levels within people's reach. This necessitated the use of crude ladders or even scaffolding. Paintings are either in monochrome or polychrome. 9. At Lower Mertitek, purple kaolin is used, and in the shelter on the south face of Enari Blaze AA, red ochre kaolin rather like blood. Elsewhere, A dazzling array of colors is to be found and stunning combinations of shades to recreate the appearance and balance of reality. This necessitated a quite complex associated technology, and traces of workshops have been found. That Ibn, for instance, little flat grindstones have been dug up along with tiny grinders to reduce the rock to powder, and also little bowls of pigment. The He pigments have turned out to be very durable, and retain an amazing freshness and vividness to this day. The He relatively extensive range of colors is based on certain basic tones such as red and brown, obtained from iron oxide ochres; white, obtained from kaolin, animal droppings, latex or zinc oxide; and black, extracted from charcoal, ground calcined bones, or from smoke and burnt fat. There are also yellow, green, violet and other colors. These ingredients were ground to a fine powder with a pestle and mortar, mixed together, and then made up with a liquid, perhaps milk, the casein in which is an excellent binder, dripping, or else white of egg, honey or cooked bone marrow. This explains the brightness of the tints after all these thousands of years. The He colors were applied with the fingers, with feathers, with strong or chewed wood spatulas, or with brushes made of animal hairs fixed to sticks with tendons. They were also sprayed on by squirting the liquid from the mouth. It was this last process that was responsible for the outlines of hands still to be seen on rock faces, and which are a kind of authenticating signature on these masterpieces. Sometimes corrections are made without erasing the original lines, giving oxen with 4 horns, men with 3 arms, and so forth. Here again, the natural features of the rock are very cleverly used, as for instance at Tbilisi, where a crevice in the rock becomes the waterhole where the herd is preparing to drink. 10. 9. In southern Africa, mainly monochrome paintings are found in the Transvaal and Namibia, whereas in Botswana, Griqualand and Natal, paintings tend to be polychrome. 10. Illustration, J.D. Leju, 1977, page 151. 662. African prehistoric art. Jewellery. The art of jewellery calls for no less advanced techniques, in fact rather the reverse. Some beads are made from cornelian, an exceptionally hard stone. The techniques used by jewelers can be reconstructed by a study of the debris left at different stages of the work. First, flat discs were made by percussion flaking followed by grinding. Then a large needle, square in section, was chipped out of a flint core and used as a graving tool. Its point was driven into the center of the disc on both sides in turn so as to produce 2 indentations back to back. Then the most delicate part of the job was to make 2 holes meet. For this, the flint stylus did duty as a twist drill, and with the help of some fine sand mixed with plant resin, the central hole was drilled right through. Other equally refractory stones such as amazonite, hematite and chalcedony were also worked, as were bone and ivory, to make pendants, bracelets and anklets. Pumice stone was used to polish them. At Tenapatan, some microdiorite drill bits were found among ostrich eggshell beads. Pottery. Clay for pottery was prepared with a binder made from cow dung. Pots were made by the coil method, that is, by taking a long rope of clay and coiling it round and round on itself, smoothing it meanwhile with the fingers and a smoothing stick. The necks of pots are of various shapes, spiral, flared, slanted and lopsided. The firing must have been impeccable, to judge by the delicate shades ranging from pink to dark brown. Slip glazing was known, as was the vegetable glaze still used in Africa today for pottery and for varnishing or ornamenting the floors, walls and roofs of houses. The marvelous decorations were done with bone combs, fish bones, and the imprint of ears of corn, rope or seeds, with enormous imagination and a great profusion of motifs. That in northern Mali, potters' kilns grouped together in a place apart testify to the prestige of this craft, whose practitioners were no less skilled than their fellow potters at Eshehaini, in what is now the modern state of the Sudan. Sculpture is also represented usually in miniature, like the ruminant lying down in the Oud Mazar Tessali or an ox lying down at Tarsaru Hagar Mountains. At Ashfu there is a little hare with its long ears laid back along its body. At Tamentit in the Tiowat, a striking head of a ram. At Wansidi, in the Great Eastern Berg, the stone sculpture of a human figure. At Tubalbalet, a splendid stylized head of an owl, and at Tenapatan, clay figurines have been found representing stylized birds. women and cattle, one of which still has a pair of twigs in lieu of horns. H. C. F. H. J. Hugot, 1974, page 155. 663. Methodology and African prehistory. Genres and styles. In broad terms, three main genres and styles may be distinguished in the Sahara, more or less coinciding with the periods mentioned above. The first is the archaic, monumental in size with symbolism overshadowing a naturalist representation. Man still seems to be suffering under the impact of his first shock at the might of the animal kingdom, which must be subdued, if necessary by magic. The stages may be distinguished. The first is the Budalus style, centered mainly on southern Oron, the Tassili and the pheasant, with carvings characterized by acute observation. The subjects are usually large animals, often standing alone. The semi-naturalistic treatment, plain and austere, confines itself to essential outlines which are drawn with masterly skill. Examples are the rhinoceros and pelicans at Oud Gerat Tassili, the elephant at Bardachat, and the elephant at Ingalgi and in the Oud Maitherndous. The second stage is characterized by the presence of antelopes and mouflons, mostly painted. Men are everywhere, men with round heads. The treatment is still semi-naturalistic, sometimes symbolist, but the line is lively rather than austere, and may betray excitement and even pathos. Magic is not far away and can be sensed in the animal totems, masked men and ritual dances. Subjects do not stand alone. There are small pictures, but also continuous friezes and frescoes, the largest in the world. This style, which is centered in the Tassili, produces scenes depicting mouflons with powerful horns, and masked dancers, as at Zifar, taken by J. Leju to be the eponymous site, and the priestess or white lady of Anret. The second main genre consists of naturalistic paintings and carvings of small subjects, either alone or in groups. The treatment is frankly descriptive. There is already a feeling that man is on the move and that he dominates and controls the cattle, dogs, sheep and goats. More colors are used. It is the Sahara of villages and encampments. The eponymous site is taken to be Jagbaran. The third genre is stylized, symbolist or abstract. Earlier techniques are retained, but often deteriorate. There is, however, no general decline. The engraving in particular degenerates into blurred outlines, with dotting and rough stippling, but in painting the delicate line, though inferior in some respects to the strong, austere line of the earlier period, is better for catching movement, sometimes in three-quarter profile, and lends itself better to stylization and new forms of expression. For instance, the MBN and Granoa Saharan Chad is outlined with an elegance reminiscent of a pen and ink drawing, with eyes, pupils, hair, mouth and nose represented with almost photographic accuracy. The use of washes also makes possible the rendering of very subtle nuances, as in the case of the antelope calf at Iharan Tassili with its unsteady legs, coming to suck its mother while she almost tenderly lowers her head to it. This genre lends itself well to the stylizing of horses and chariots and subsequently of the dromedary, but it also lends itself to 664. African prehistoric art. The stylization of man, who becomes two isosceles triangles as at Assajan Melon, or has nothing but a long neck where his head should be. The tendency is thus both to the mannerisms of pencil drawing and also to somewhat slapdash stylized geometrical representation, which, by the end of the period, occurs alongside characters from the Numidion and the Tifin alphabets. It is evident from many details, such as Arab saddles with cantles, which are obviously later than the 7th century of our era, that such compositions fall well outside the realm of prehistory. Some comments are called for on these genres which follow one another without sharp chronological dividing lines. The second stage of the archaic style, in particular, is heterogeneous, and the embling box at Sifar bears no relation to the heads with masks and symbolic motifs. There are, in addition, certain stereotypes which straddle several genres and styles, such as the pictorial convention by which oxen are depicted with the head in profile and the horns full face, as at Wendender. There are also stereotyped gestures and postures, like those of the herdsman with one arm outstretched and the other akimbo. Lastly, there are very obvious regional motifs, such as the ram in southern Oron, and the spiral in the Tassili, which does not appear in the pheasant or southern Oron. On the other hand, Sexual themes are particularly characteristic of the pheasant and the tassel. Turning to other forms of art, we find that geometrical ornamentation on ostrich eggs occurs in jewelry in the Upper Caspian, but it is above all to the Sudanic tradition of the Neolithic period that we owe the tools and weapons, the splendid mottled flint brooches polished with green and dark red, the pottery with wavy line decoration, and the tissue arrowheads with their meticulously polished denticulations and their perfect triangular shape. In other parts of Africa, the typology is still being worked out. In Namibia, for instance, one authority claims 20 different colored strata and styles, with 4 main stages: a stage with large animals treated in an archaic style, without representations of human figures; b. small panels with representations of human figures; c. a monochrome stage with hunting scenes and lively ritual dances; and d. a polychrome period in which the heights of artistry are reached, as in the Philip Cape Shelter Damaraland and the Brandberg paintings, which have been dated to the year 1500. Frobenius distinguished 2 main styles of rock art in southern Africa. In the southern part, from the Transvaal to the Cape and from the eastern Drakensberg to the coast of Namibia, he saw a naturalistic trend in which animals predominate, often treated individually and with consummate skill, the folds in a pachyderm's hide and the stripes on a zebra's coat being accurately rendered. But the style is stiff and cold, even though the paintings are in subtle polychrome, the colors being rubbed on with remarkable dexterity. There are set-piece hunting scenes, dances, processions and gatherings. From the central Transvaal to the Zambezi, on the other hand, i.e. Zambia, Zimbabwe and Malawi, the painting is in 665. Methodology and African prehistory. Monochrome, essentially the red and ochre of iron oxides, sometimes verging on purple. The natural rock is granite, as against sandstone in the previous case. The technique is that of drawing, and is as realistic as the washes in the south, but it is not a mechanical type of realism. Landscapes are realistic, but their representation reveals a tremendously fertile imagination. The makes his appearance as broad-shouldered and wasp-waisted, in a word, wedge-shaped. Seen from in front, his limbs are depicted in profile, as in Egyptian bas-reliefs. In the south, in the hunting and battle scenes that are sometimes intermingled, the people are more natural, with more rounded limbs, whereas in the north we find solemn funeral scenes, perhaps royal obsequies with people giving vent to poignant displays of grief. Animals, as for instance in the Great Cave at Inoro, filed past not like a well-marshaled Noah's Ark but like some weird bestiary. There are gigantic birds with beaks like crocodiles' jaws, giant elephants with crenellated backs, and 2-headed animals. Sometimes myths, like that of rain, are elaborated. The background of these grotesque frescoes consists of landscapes, in which stylized rocks, botanically identifiable trees and lakes full of fish are comprehensibly arranged. This is the style in Zimbabwe, less animated than in the south, but fraught with stormy or poignant emotions. According to Frobenius, the wedge style was associated with a highly developed civilization, and we know that such civilizations existed in the Zimbabwe area. He also thought that this austere, angular style gave way to a more rounded, subtler, more mannered and more effeminate style as the societies degenerated. 3. In Upper Volta, the rock carvings in the north of the country, for example, at Aribanda, are semi-naturalistic or stylized, whilst in the south they tend to be geometrical. There are also paintings in the caves of the Banfora Cliffs. In the Central African Republic, excavation has revealed sites with evidence of human occupation from before the Acheulean up to the Iron Age. 5 centers of rock art have been identified: the Toulouse shelter in the Entdeel area, occupied from prehistoric times up to the present, with very early red stylized figures and white figures with their arms akimbo; the Kampala shelter, and the sites with carvings at Mpa2 Springs and Lango Mbiamu. This tradition bears little relation to that of the Sahara, but rather more to the pictures found in East Africa and Southern Africa. 14. 12. By and large, the representation of wild animals and animals in general is naturalistic for magical reasons, since the picture must reproduce the object of the ritual as accurately as possible. Human figures, on the other hand, are often deliberately diagrammatical, since the point is to shield them from magical influences. 13. Cf. E. Haberland, 1973, page 27. 14. cf. R. D. Bell de Hermans, 1976. 666. African prehistoric art. Motives and meanings. The term petroglyph has been coined for rock pictures. More than any other, in fact, this kind of art is a sign language, that is, a bridge between reality and idea. It is a set of graphic symbols, and to read it one needs a key. When it comes to explaining it properly, the main drawback is our ignorance of the society that produced it. That is why it is important not to make over-hasty interpretations by omitting the descriptive stage in which the sign language itself is subjected to formal analysis. In very many instances, the actual description is already couched in descriptive terms. The ideal thing might be to adopt a statistical approach, collecting quantitative and qualitative data collected for as many pictures as possible, so as to allow of a comparative analysis. 15. This would make it possible to tell, for instance, whether the sign systems found in a particular number of pictures conformed to any general principle in either time or space. The more thorough the data compiled, the more plausible the reconstructed development pattern would be. In any event, hypotheses stemming from formal analysis of this kind would only be borne out if they tally with the mass of data which goes to make up the whole social system in question. The prehistoric picture is, after all, only a minute component of an information macrosystem, in other words, of a culture containing many other components. At this level of analysis, we begin to realize how complex the system of signs we need to grasp the real meaning of a work of art. Quite apart from this, a work of art may have a concealed meaning as well as its obvious one, for a sign is not only a sign of something but also a sign which means something to somebody and, as such, is a symbol. We have to graduate, therefore, from morphology to social syntax, and be capable of taking the step forward from the point where we make a straightforward comment on a purely representational picture, in which the meaning is plain, to that where we can decipher the coded message conveyed by an abstract picture. This is where reference to the cultural context is indispensable, since the thing signified is represented differently in different cultures. The remoter the sign is from the object it denotes, the more culture-specific and the more significant it is. The same piece of onomatopoeia recurring in several languages is not characteristic of any one of them, for it merely reflects the same sound in nature, but the same is not true of a word in any given language. Great art collections may perhaps be regarded as transmitting stations sending out cultural messages, but the question then arises of what the receivers are. The transmitters may often have broadcast primarily for the benefit of those who set them up, as well as for their society as a whole, and we have not been left enough other remains to enable us to read and decipher their messages. In short, the problems and methods of 15. This quantitative approach might conceivably lend itself to computer analysis, subject to all the appropriate precautions. On this topic see the work of a editor at the Frobenz Institute in Frankfurt, of which Professor Haberland is the director. 667. Methodology and African Prehistory. Artistic exploration must in the end come down to the description of the types of culture underlying these partial manifestations. If we can define the cultures that were their natural element, we can then attempt to reconstruct the historical framework into which they fitted. This is why providing African rock paintings with captions such as Justices of the Peace, The White Lady, Man Pulling Teeth, Josephine sold by her sisters, Martians, and such like, distort them from the outset, since they impose on them an interpretation of a single observer from another civilization, with quite different symbols and codes. 6. African prehistoric art must be interpreted by reference to indigenous values, and it is only when the local environment of time, space and culture fails to provide an answer to a problem that we are entitled to look elsewhere for the solution. Having said this, I suggest that there are two main approaches to the interpretation of prehistoric art, the idealist approach and the materialist one. From the idealist standpoint, this type of art is mainly an expression of the view of the world of the people who created this art. Only a knowledge of this view can provide an explanation of the subject matter and also of its treatment. The art of Southern Africa, writes Eric Holm, is seen in its true light if we regard it as the expression of religious fervor and the urge to transcend reality. This was the metaphysics of primitive man, and the animal figures are nothing but a mask to hide the true nature of man's aspirations. Rather than letting ourselves be drawn into controversy, Let us rest content with the information supplied by myths. It is explicit enough. 17 Thus mythological and cosmological symbolism is the main key to an understanding of the world of rock art. Frobenius has brilliantly developed this proposition, although he also added sociological considerations. According to him, the lion at Fonte is carved on the east face of the rock so as to be lit up by the first rays of the sun, because it symbolizes the sun, whereas the rhinoceros faces west because it is the spirit of night and darkness. Another element to consider is that the rhinoceros, whose horns symbolize the crescent of the new moon, is considered in many African mythologies to have murdered the moon. Holm also speaks of the ritual uses of caves in remote massifs. The cosmological legend which the German philologist Willem Bleek collected early from the sand in the 19th century led him to say that they do not distinguish between matter and spirit. The Cape antelope drawn with atrophied limbs symbolizes the rising moon. Then it is shown facing human figures, as in the Herrenveen Gallery Drakensberg. The men are supposed to be worshipping it. The high-spirited, red-striped chamois symbolizes stormy weather, the praying mantis, lightning, and the elephant, rain clouds, is made. 16. On this question see the pertinent comments of J.D. Lejeune, 1977, pages 1 is RFF. Without for a moment denying the Abbé Bru's right to his sense of humor, nor his immense learning and his great services to the study of prehistory in general and African prehistory in particular, it must be said that he too often succumbed to this tendency. 17. E. Holm in L'Ardance Mont. LHDTR, pages I-83 FF, I-70 FF, etc. 668. African prehistoric art. Be seen at Mount Street, Paul Drakensberg. This myth crops up again not only elsewhere in Africa, for example, at Philip Cave, in Namibia, and Jebel Bisseg and Amgedi Ga in Algeria, but also on an ivory carving at La Madeleine in France. The magnificent Cape antelope in the Transvaal Museum has a coat the color of honey. This is thought simply to recall that the antelope was created by the praying mantis, the incarnation of the sun, and that the mantis smeared it with purest honey to make its coat glossy. The reason why the quagga is sometimes depicted without stripes, as at Enswatuji Cave in the Matipo Mountains, Zimbabwe, is that originally the quagga had no stripes. It was only as a result of getting its back sunburned that it acquired the burnt marks on its coat, and so on. According to this view of things, all that would be needed in order to have a master key to all the riddles of African rock art, timeless as myth, would be a detailed knowledge of African pantheistic beliefs. This is surely a forlorn hope. The supporters of the materialist approach, on the other hand, hold that prehistoric art, like all other kinds of art, is merely the reflection of the material conditions of life in a given society, an ideological current and an instrument of that society's culture expressing a particular ecological and sociological balance and enabling man to preserve it or adjust it in his favor. Each of these approaches seems incomplete by itself, and in my view a synthesis is called for. African prehistoric art unquestionably conveyed the social and educational message. The San, who nowadays are the people nearest to the life portrayed in rock art, say that their forefathers explained the sand view of the world to them by means of the great picture book of rock paintings. The education of peoples without a written language is primarily audiovisual, that is, it is based on sound and image, as may be seen in the initiation rites of young people in sub-Saharan Africa to this day. Petroglyphs are something similar. Nevertheless, myth is obviously not the whole explanation, since, before myth can be produced, society itself must be produced and reproduced. Thus myth can be an ideal way of improving or impairing productive forces and the production relations. Holmes suggests this himself when he quotes the case of the young sand, convinced that his gleaming quartz arrowhead is a particle of the star to which he prays, as he sharpens his point, "You who never miss, you who are infallible, make them hit them like warrior." This sentence is essentially utilitarian in scope, exactly the opposite of the idealist conclusion that the author draws from it. In order to survive, man marshals and modalizes the universe. That is the function of myth, but I do not believe it is its only function. We must not let the trees of symbolism stop us seeing the wood of reality. 818. From the historian's point of view there is sometimes much to be learned from myths. Thus according to the San, The sun grew tired of being carried on the zebra's back, and deserted it to take refuge between the bull's horns. This takes us to the other end of the continent and depictions in Egypt, southern Oron and the Sahara of oxen bedecked with the solar disk. We may wonder whether the cow goddess Hathor is not in fact the product of a Pan-African myth. 669. Methodology and African prehistory. The spiritual function can, in fact, sometimes exist independently, in which case it stops being a means and becomes an end in itself. Myth, after all, represents for the end a way of understanding the universe by ordering it, that is, by rationalizing it in a particular way, since mythology is not without a kind of inner logic. The spiritual purpose does exist even if it often carries a functional content. To portray a feared being is already to liberate oneself from it, and to keep it under one's eye is to overcome it. Is the almost tangible mineral silence investing the blind and secret stone passages that Ibtinin and Tisabka expressive of remembered rites and sanctuaries and places of initiation, or of the hiding place of stolen livestock? Perhaps both. The people wearing animal masks, and the animals with discs, aureoles, rods, etc. on their heads, 19 often found together in southern Oron and Gujarat, suggest the idea of people in an attitude of prayer before animals. Again, the three masked hunters at Gujarat, apparently heading in a buffalo carrying a disc, may possibly represent the scene of sympathetic magic. Since masks are still used by some African peoples, it might be preferable to base interpretations on this actual cultural material, rather than engaging in pure speculation. It would be found that the explanation is not always a religious one. This day hunters in the Sahel zone wear the hornbill's head and bob it up and down in imitation of this bird so as to be able to creep up on an antelope on all fours and shoot their arrows at it from close range. Sometimes, however, the disproportion between method and result is so great that magic is strongly suggested, as when a masked man effortlessly drags a dead rhinoceros along on its back, in the carving that inhabitor, Lydia. In some cases, fertility rites are clearly the motive of the figures who appear to be engaged in ritual intercourse, e.g. the coitus between a woman and a masked man, act in Lale and Lydia, or who are performing vigorous dances with protuberant phalluses. Fertility, in fact, was what mattered most, especially in the Sahara and Namibia desert at the end of the prehistoric period, when all forms of life were in retreat before the relentlessly advancing drought. A hexagonal carnelian jewel from the Neolithic site at Tinfalki has been recognized by Hampabab as a fertility charm used to this day by Fulani women. 2. In this particular case the aesthetic motive is not to be dismissed either, for the men and women of the African Neolithic were Homo sapiens like ourselves, and they cannot be denied the species-specific pleasure we take in creating shapes simply for the pleasure of looking at them. The admiration we feel today at these works of art must have been still livelier when the pictures were quite fresh and the model for them abounded in the immediate neighborhood. The little grinders for cosmetic powder and the Amazonite, chalcedony and ostrich eggs held beads at Genera, not to mention the supremely graceful lines of 19. See the famous examples of the ox at Maadib, Lydia, and the ram at Budalan, Saharan Atlas. 20. The cross at Agades or Thorowan perhaps evolved from the sign of Tanit, a female sex symbol. 670. African prehistoric art. The tanged axes speak volumes for the aesthetic taste of the Africans of those days. Examples abound of rough sketches abandoned as unsatisfactory. Again, many of the pictures are so exposed to the elements for the first chance passerby that their secular character must be beyond all doubt. It was often folk art, in the sense also that there was probably a conscious sense of recording for posterity. Pleasure in recollection and the desire to perpetuate the memory of individual or group exploits is also one of the characteristics of our human species. The N is a born chronicler, and the artists of prehistory are the first African historians, since they have left us a legible record of the successive stages of African man's relationship with his natural and social environment. The burden of history, or art as a document, let us consider to what extent African prehistoric art can be regarded as the illustrated edition of the first African history book. In the first place, it constitutes a documentary film about the infrastructure of the first societies to live on our continent, for example, of their environment. This biotope can be observed directly in the objects found in situ, but it can equally well be deduced from the subject matter of the pictures. A note of warning must be sounded because a pictorial representation is not necessarily an objective account of the actual surroundings. The artist might be recalling old memories, or portraying fantasies or dreams. In actual fact, however, the overwhelming weight of evidence agrees with the finding of geomorphological studies on the extent of prehistoric lakes and ancient water courses and puts the matter beyond doubt. Hope has found hippopotamus bones at a site at Booz, radiocarbon dated to 5140 BP, which confirms the historical accuracy of, for instance, the group of hippopotamuses depicted at a Sajan melon. This animal is an ecological indicator since it required perennial water in order to exist. The elephant, which eats enormous quantities of vegetation daily, is another indicator, and the Sahara of the prehistoric paintings must have been a great expanse of parkland with Mediterranean vegetation, traces of which have survived to this day. This environment gradually gave way to a Sudanic Sahel biotope. In the horse and chariot period, some representations of trees are found, such as palm trees, no doubt indicating oases. In southern Africa, the northern Rhodesian style is full of drawings of trees, some of which are identifiable. Shelters in areas that are now desert are peopled with a teeming, varied fauna, like some latter-day Noah's Ark or a zoo turned to stone. There are carvings of fish, tremendous shaggy wild animals like the extinct buffalo, with its enormous horns up to 3 meters. 21. Cf. Y. and M. Vile, 1974. 671. Methodology and African Prehistory. Across, felines like the cheetah and the aardwolf, gurnons and baboons at Tintazarift, ostriches, owls, and so on. On all sides there are hunting scenes, reminders of the perennial duel between man and beast. These lively and sometimes violent scenes, where intelligence triumphs over brute force, are somewhat reminiscent of the hunters reported by Yoya in the Nile Valley of pre-dynastic Egypt, with their phallic sheaths between their legs, their curved weapons and their false tails, which are in fact as in tropical Africa. To this day animal skins worn crosswise over the shoulders. But here and there is a lion hunt in which the quarry is encircled by a ring of threatening lances. At Tisabkite, an onager that has been killed is about to be cut up. In the Nile Valley, in Libya and throughout the Sahara there are innumerable representations of traps, demonstrating the manifold ingenuity of the MBN who adapted their techniques to the habits and habitats of the wild animals. 22. This profusion of hunting scenes from the Nile to the Atlantic is vivid illustration of the existence of a whole hunting civilization. Even larger animals like the elephant did not escape, as witness the great hunting scenes at Upper Mertutek. Traps are nearly everywhere associated with the symbols of hunters in a very original cultural pattern, which existed over almost the whole of Africa for tens of thousands of years until very late in the historical period, as the legend of Sunjata bears out. These pictures also show the gradual transition from trapping animals or taking them into captivity, to feeding them and then to domesticating them. There is a man armed with a bow holding an animal on a leash, whilst at Tirsabkite mouflon are being hunted with hounds. The lifelike Saluki at Sifar, with its curly tail, was obviously the friend of desert MBN then as now. At Jabaran there is a scene showing a MBN lying in wait for a wild animal. He is armed with a curved weapon, and there is another animal with its ears pricked behind him, seemingly domesticated. The varieties of oxen are depicted such as Bos ibiricus with its short, stout horns in the south and Bos africanus with its great lyre-shaped horns at Tagat, Jabaran and elsewhere. These animals sometimes have a pendant round their necks, as at Oudjarat. Then there are cattle with their horns splendidly worked, decorated and artificially twisted into a spiral, as at Ibn. The ass being hunted in the scene at Tirsabkite is the same variety as had been domesticated since the Neolithic, where it is shown being ridden. There are also sheep and goats. Even boats are depicted, including one at Tintazarif shaped rather like the papyrus boats of the lakes and rivers of Chad and Nubia. There are paintings at Ibn showing men bending down using. 22. There are stockades and nets, trigger traps, ditches and pits, breakback traps, locking traps, tension traps and torsion traps, as at Gaotimni on the Niger-Chad border, where a giraffe is immobilized by a complicated tension mechanism which brings its head and neck right down to the horizontal. For details of the research done on this important subject, see P. Howard and J. Leckland, 1973, pages I-30ff. 672. African prehistoric art. Angled tools, which are reminiscent of the harvest scenes with sickles of pharaonic bas-reliefs. Again, paintings of womb and bending in the characteristic posture of people winnowing or gleaning suggest a Neolithic cereal cultivation in the Sahara, and this is borne out by the superabundance of grindstones and grinders which have been found. 2-3 pollen studies carried out on samples from the Sahara nevertheless point the need for caution, and what is depicted may have been no more than the gathering of wild crops. Besides, the demarcation line between growing little patches of food and agriculture properly so called is not an easy one to draw. At Battle Cave, some girls are depicted setting off food gathering, their digging sticks over their shoulders. Be that as it may, the sheer profusion of the rock art and of the tools and weapons found in vast areas of Africa, especially those that are now desert, gives an interesting idea of the population density in those areas. The quantity of artifacts sometimes suggests semi-industrial production, as for instance northeast of Beecher and in the Erewaberg, and even as reported by T. Morneau in the Majuba Western Sahara. African prehistoric art has also much to tell us about the clothing of the people of those days. As often happens in early civilizations, we find that the men were more decoratively dressed than the women, until the OX period, when the situation seems to have been reversed. Dressed in animal skins, bedecked with ornate headbands or feather coats, they sport a variety of sometimes enigmatic insignia in the form of collars, armbands and bracelets. The women are often depicted in minimal garb, sometimes wearing a strip of cotton material passing between the legs and tucked under a belt, with the loose ends falling at front and back, common among the girls of the Sudan. There are also loincloths, with various arrangements of the lower folds, clinging dresses, varieties of brassiere and all kinds of headdresses, including a crested one as at Jagbaran. The home is often depicted schematically by hemispheres representing huts, in which furniture and also family scenes can be seen. The discoveries at the Tisha Cliffs, Mauritania, where 127 villages have so far been identified, show that Neolithic Africans were also builders. Perched on spurs forming the southward extension of the Dark, these clusters of drifstone buildings, each housing about 3,000 people, often rest upon the substructure of cyclopean masonry somewhat reminiscent of the Zimbabwe's of Central and Southern Africa. This type of architecture, which is remarkable for the period, is characterized by carved stones supporting pillars. 24. The frescoes of African rock art thus afford us a glimpse of a whole society, and a very lifelike glimpse it is. At Takid Tumatin, for instance, buxom women looking as though they had been well fed milk are sitting in front of the huts with their children. Calves are carefully tethered in a row. 23. Some of the finest are those brought back by the Relict Genera expedition. 24. Ch. J. Hugott's work on Tiship in H. J. Hugot et al., 1973. 673. Methodology and African Prehistory. To a rope, whilst men are busy milking the cows. It is an evening scene, bespeaking pastoral peace and quiet. We may wonder whether the number of women suggests polygyny. At Orange Springs and Ancosy Stream Natal there are lifelike dancing scenes showing people, mostly women, clapping their hands in a group around masked dancers. At Jagbaran, a woman is dragging her unwilling child along. At Sifar, the MBN is pulling on a calf's rope, which among some present-day Fulani herdsmen is still a holy object. Tangle. The vast fresco at the Iharan shelter, one of the high points of prehistoric painting, shows finely caparisoned oxen, ridden by women in rich attire, passing by with water skins hanging from their flanks. Some animals are lowering their heads to the water hole, whilst a huge herd moves forward in stately fashion. Women in their finery are lounging outside their homes, and men with horse tails have stopped, seemingly to greet them. Inside the huts various items of furniture are to be seen. At Ibn Ibtinin there is a scene with notables in state attire and warriors in uniform, showing that society is beginning to develop along hierarchical lines. Archers in coats look as though they are drawn up in squads under a commander. There is here even the suggestion of a police force. In southern Africa, war scenes abound, telling of the succession of wars between the San and the Bandit. but none of this interfered with love. There are many scenes showing that African prehistoric artists had no inhibitions about the sexual side of life. There are pictures of animals in rut, as on the west spur at Blake AA, where two rhinoceroses are shown, one sniffing the other's sex organs. Elsewhere a he-goat is shown mounting the she-goat. There are naive but realistic scenes of human intercourse in various positions, showing that man has not invented anything important in this field since distant times. A Hana rock in Gujarat Tassili portrays a whole scene of masked men with giant erect phalluses on the point of penetrating women lying in the posture of intercourse. All the details are shown. The H. Great fresco at Tinlale and Caucasus, Libya is largely devoted to the same orgiastic theme. Hugot Brugman, N.O. 164. In Ararat there is a more prosaic scene showing coitus a turbo, whilst at Timezausin Tassili a couple in action is shown in the company of three other couples still on their feet, the not altogether serious show of resistance being offered by the women being rendered to perfection. When we come to magic and religion, we are compelled to admit that many pictures still remain obscure, encapsulated in the mystery of myths. We do not know the meaning of the two-headed oxen or the oxen with two hermaphrodite bodies and but a single head to be seen at Gujarat, nor of the magnificently carved spirals associated with many animals, as with the bubalus at Gujarat. This motif, also found on Guruk pottery, seems to be connected with hunting ritual or sympathetic magic, like the spiral of the snake Mahan from the Vinite period 1st and 2nd Egyptian. 674. African prehistoric art. Dynasties. 25. Some scholars consider that the spiral symbolizes the continuity of life. As for the umbilical link to be seen between two people, as for instance one starting at the intersection of a woman's thighs and ending at the navel of a BOWMEN out hunting, it seems as though it stands for a magical flux going from the mother who is praying, with upraised hands to her son, WHO is in a dangerous situation. Again, in southern Africa Botswana a rain-making animal sacrifice is shown being led across the country on a rope held by a procession of brisk-looking people. Sun motifs form part of the same religious background. There are some pictures, nevertheless, that are still obscured, but they will only ever be explained by reference to a genuinely African cultural and religious context. This is what happened with regard to a scene at Tintagel Rift, previously entitled Conventionalized Oxen. Because their legs seemed to be reduced to stumps, it had been supposed that they were lying down, but Hampaba realized that in fact they had been led into the water as part of the lottery ceremony to celebrate the ox's aquatic origin. Next to this scene is an indecipherable finger motif in which Hampaba detected an allusion to the myth of the hand of the first herdsman, Kikula. This hand symbolizes the Fulani clans, the colors of oxen's coats and the four natural elements. 26. In general, the development suggests a transition from magic, which was often associated with paroxysmal dances, to religion, as exemplified by a sequence in the Great Frieze at Ibn depicting the sacrifice of a sheep. Influences and migrations. The tendency to explain all the features of African culture by the theory of outside influence must be rejected. This does not, however, mean denying any outside influence, but simply involves defining it carefully. Franco-Cantabrian rock art, which goes back about 40,000 years, is Paleolithic and hence earlier than African prehistoric art. Saharan Neolithic, on the other hand, is earlier than European Neolithic. 27. There was thus a strong temptation to argue that the inspiration of artists on the African continent came from the north, and there was even talk of a Eurafrican art with its focal point in Europe. In fact, the sort of Hamitic theory in the field of African prehistoric art. There is no truth in this at all. Quite apart from the fact that there is a difference of 15,000 years in the development of the two schools of art, it is accepted that the art of Eastern Spain which would have had to be the 25. See also a role of the snake in African cosmology. 26. We must admittedly be wary of automatically extrapolating modern myth and legend backwards in time in order to explain every detail of the symbols found in prehistory. Cf. J.D. Lejeune, 1977. 27. The Saharan Neolithic goes back at least to the 8th millennium before our era, whereas not so long ago the accepted view was that it was later than North African, Egyptian and Near Eastern Neolithic. H. L. Hope, 1976, page 227. 675. Methodology and African Prehistory. Connecting link for any influence there was has nothing been COMMON with the art of Southern Oron, the Tasselite and the Fezzan. L. Belout has argued that there is no connection between North African prehistory and Spain in the Upper Paleolithic. Moreover, the Capsian origin of the carvings of Southern Oron and the Sahara is rejected by practically all authors. The real flowering of prehistoric art came from the Atlas, and its focal points are nothing if not African. People have also wondered whether it was not from the east, that is, from the Nile Valley, that this type of art radiated out to the interior of the continent. It is obvious that the art of the Egyptian Nile flourished much later than that of Saharan and Sudanic Africa. The Saharan representations of oxen with discs between their horns are much earlier than those of the cow goddess Hathor. The hawk delicately carved on the sandstone plaque at Adl ear is much earlier than the similar but smaller figures the forerunners of Horus on the lozenges of pre-dynastic Egyptian tombs. The magnificent ram with a spear at Budaland is much earlier than the ram of Mon, which only appears in Egypt in the time of the 18th dynasty. Whe and Andrew Gallrod looked at the animal heads at Ouadjarat. He considered them to be forerunners of the Egyptian animal deities. The same no doubt holds good for the bird-headed goddesses at Jagbaran. Semele naturalism only appears in Egypt in the Jersean period, and is derived from Saharan X period carvings. An example is the pictures at Oudhmm, which are in any case of inferior workmanship. The superb Egyptian type boats depicted in the Sahara, for example, at Tintazarift, are no doubt simply Saharan type boats. The silhouettes at Argtixakai, which supposedly portray the Hyksos, Pharaoh and Antinia with his headdress supposedly representing the pharaonic /wamp/ in you need to be seen the other way round in terms of historical perspective. So of course Egypt had a tremendous influence on the interior of Africa, though no doubt it was limited. But what is even more certain is that the prehistoric civilization of the Sahara is earlier in time. It is also true that no obstacle except distance separated the peoples of the Haggard, Tasselite and the Fezzan from the Nile Valley, which was for a long time until the drying up of the Sahara a rather unpleasant swampy area. It was only from the so-called historic period onwards that Egyptian civilization achieved that splendor, as a result of which, presumably on the principle of to him that hath shall be given, everything is attributed to it. But where art and technology are concerned, the focal points were originally in the Sahara, in the modern Republic of the Sudan, in East Africa and in the Near East. Moreover, the prehistoric Sahara owed much more to southeastern influences than to those from the Near East. As for the contacts supposed to have taken place between southern Africa and the Sahara area, they do not seem to be based on solid evidence, although Frobenz drew attention to some analogies. 28. There has even been talk of a Magosian. 28. Cf. He had Berland, 1973, page 74. 676. African prehistoric art. Civilization, which according to Holm was almost Pan-African, but nothing very clear emerges about it. Prehistoric works of art in southern Africa are in any case generally later than those in Africa north of the equator, even though the southern part of the continent was populated from an extremely early date. 29. As has already been stressed, it is quite wrong to put the great period of the paintings of the Drakensberg Mountains in the 17th century of our era, that is, after the arrival of the bandit. In any case, the painting of the South shows no stylistic affinity with the so-called Roundhead period in the Sahara, and seems related only to the OX period. It is also distinguished by certain characteristic themes, such as abundant vegetation, landscapes with stylized representations of rocks, and funeral scenes. Be that as it may, comparative studies need to be pursued further, and, above all, the general background to the history of African prehistoric Homo sapiens needs to be elucidated, before we can think of drawing arrows to mark the direction of artistic movements. This remark applies with even greater force when we come to consider the races responsible for this type of art. Indeed, to use the concept of race here at all is surely a misuse of the word. 3 degrees. It is questionable whether the few skeletons and bones that have been found are sufficient justification for the bold theories put forward concerning peopling by prehistoric races. Nevertheless, an extremely complex demographic process has been mapped out by some authors as follows. After the initial peopling by indigenous Africans, Neanderthal people from the Near East supposedly migrated to Africa in 2 branches, one going as far as Morocco and the other to the East African highlands via the Horn of Africa. These were the Atyrians of the Middle Paleolithic. Subsequently, after a Mesolithic episode probably related to the Cymalaean in Egypt, another wave of Cro-Magnon people arrived in North Africa. These included an Ibero-Maurusian strain and Capsian strain. These groups presumably developed stone industries in their new habitat, giving rise in particular to the Capsian Neolithic tradition in amongst other areas in northern Sahara. Meanwhile, the remarkable technological and artistic diversification was taking place in other centers. Particularly noteworthy was the powerful influence of the Sudanic and Ghanaian Neolithic traditions, with secondary foci in Tenra and on the Atlantic coast of northern Mauritania. 31. Some authors hold that the Baixado period of rock art is to be attributed to ill-defined Mediterranean people, white or half-caste according to different authors. The so-called 29. Cf. Chapter 20 of this volume, by J.D. Clark. Some authors have suggested that rock art spread from Zimbabwe to Namibia and the Cape, then to the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and finally for highly developed polychrome again from Zimbabwe to Namibia. Cf. 8. R. Wilcox, 1963. 30. The process of speciation referred to by J. Ruffle must have been largely reversed, particularly since the homogeneity of the Sahara as a habitat must have been conducive to interbreeding. See Theories on the Races and History of Africa, pages 261-9 above. 31. Cf. H. J. Hugot, 1974, pages 60-ff. 677. Methodology and African Prehistory. Roundhead period is attributed to Negroids whom some consider to have interbred with peoples from the Near East and who supposedly constitute the Sudanic Neolithic tradition. The OX period was supposedly the work of the ancestors of the Fulani. Lastly, the influence of the so-called Ghanaian tradition, farther south, extended as far as the buildings of the Tisha Cliffs, Mauritania. The whole of this reconstruction, it must be said, remains highly precarious and gives too much weight to population movements from outside Africa. People even refer to the distinct African influence in a Sahara rock picture. But above all, this reconstruction tends to equate concepts as different as race, ethnic group, lifestyle and culture. People refer to blacks, whites, Fulani, Africans, Capsians and Sudanic peoples without defining any of these terms, for obvious reasons. L. Hope, for instance, rejects the idea of Capsian influence in the carvings of the Baixado period. 32. Yet he says that in the carvings at Oud Gerat there is not a single truly Negroid profile. All those that can be made out are unquestionably Caucasoid. We must therefore assume that these were whites, which is exactly the impression we get from looking at the figures in southern Oron and the Fezzan. What a pity, a South African colleague said to me one day, that they cannot speak! 33 is on the strength of the same flimsy anthropometrical pointers that the Roundhead period is attributed to the blacks and the OX period to the Fulani. The identification of races, however, is often based also on lifestyles and cultures, which is a gross aberration. The people of the Sudanic Neolithic are defined as the ethnic group of the herdsmen-hunters from the east. The delicate features, the herding methods, the women's crested headdresses and the men's plates are all that is needed to attribute all rock art exhibiting these features to the Fulani, and this despite the fact that the latter nowadays show no tastes of this kind, and have not even retained the memory of them, as for instance the San have. Also, this claim is made despite the fact that all the stages and styles, as well as all physical types, overlap widely in the rock art. In almost any part of tropical Africa to this day it would be possible to assemble the whole range of profiles found in the Sahara paintings. 34. This also ignores the fact that a Fulani painter may have portrayed masked dancers, just as a Negro artist may perfectly well have depicted scenes of pastoral life, or have changed his heroes' and heroines' features, as some Senegalese painters do today. After all, the little Sen often depict themselves as tall, slim and graceful, with hypertrophied anatomies. All art is convention, and nobody is ever seen a black people composed entirely of round heads. Furthermore, it is questionable whether specialization. 32. Cf. H. L. Hope, 1976. P. No. 33. Hibbett, page 41. 34. P.V. Tobias also notes that all sizes and shapes of skull are to be found among the Khoi of the Cape. 678. African prehistoric art into pastoral and agricultural peoples was as sharply defined then as it is today. 35. H. J. Hugot very rightly says of the Mauritanian Neolithic, when they arrived, the black men of Tiship had their oxen with them. He says elsewhere that the Middle Pastoral period saw the arrival of the Negroid elements. This was the Great OX period, with herds of oxen depicted in profusion. 36 Pastoralism is thus not a sufficient criterion, nor are cranial indices nor subjective impressions of types of features. It is not races that make history, and modern science does not include race among men's physical characteristics. 37 The white ladies in African rock paintings, like the one in South Africa whose face only is white, reminding the Abbé Brahe of the frescoes at Knossos, and processions of prospectors from the Persian Gulf no doubt represent priests, hunters of African girls coming out of initiation ceremonies, just as they are to be seen today painted, with white kaolin, which denotes the death of a previous personality in order to acquire a new status. 38 The authorship of the rock pictures in southern Africa is also a matter of some controversy. In this case, however, rather more is known about the general historical background, which is a matter first of relations between the Khoi and the San, and then between the Khoisan and the Bandit. There are many pictures depicting this historical movement. Statistical comparison of the hand imprints on rocks corresponds to the build of the San, and so do the steatachygeal and the semi-erect penis. The Saharan engravings of the horse and chariot period relate to historical times. The question has been raised, on the other hand, whether the painters and the engravers were from different peoples, the former operating in the shelters and the latter on the hillsides. It seems not. The painters could not generally operate in the open, since if they did their works would have been washed away and lost. On the other hand, the dolerite or dye base of the copies was better material for engraving. It produced a nice contrast between the ochre of the patina and the grey or blue of the inside of the rock, which the limestone of the shelters did not. Besides, paintings and engravings are sometimes found in the same place, and there are some. 35. It is remarkable that we know no reliable criterion for distinguishing between the men of the Butavu's period and those of the early pastoral period Ox 1. Hence the existence of bovines, almost certainly domesticated, at the time of the fine naturalistic carvings means that livestock appeared on the scene relatively early. T. Morneau, January 1951. 36. H. J. Hugot, 1974, pages 225 to 74. 37. Cf. Theories on the Races and History of Africa, pages 261 to 9. 38. Many authors consider that the White Lady of Brandburg, reproductions of which are not faithful to the original, is in fact a young man, judging by the bow, the narrow hips and the prominent sex organ, as often found among the San, whose penis is semi-erect. As to color, it should be noted that the face is not painted but represented by the natural rock. The body is pink from the feet up to the waist, and black above. In any case, color is meaningless. We find red elephants, monkeys and women, and white men. Cf. 8. R. Wilcox, 1963, pages 43 to 5. 679. Methodology and African Prehistory. Engravings that have been painted, as in the Tarkelstad district. Again, the same aesthetic conventions are sometimes found in both categories of picture. In the field of aesthetics proper, African prehistoric art is the source of inspiration for, and the brilliant introduction to, modern African art, whose roots have so far been very little studied. Prehistoric art comprises a wealth of styles, which can sometimes be traced almost step by step down to modern African art. The latter has borrowed much from Arab and European art, but there is also an ancient tradition whose roots are to be found in the rock shelters and prehistoric galleries. Painting is based on a few primary colors such as red ochre, white, black and yellow, with the addition of blue and green. To this day this range of colors turns up in masks and dancers' regalia. It is an art characterized by observation, by an almost moving and sometimes reverent attention to real life. Carving and painting both show this, but in different ways. The ox at Orksburg, Botswana, only the front portion of which has survived, is delineated with an impeccable line that brings out the minutest anatomical details of the muzzle, eyes, ears and hair. The giraffe at Unrise Lake AA is a remarkable piece of realistic engraving. The H spots on the coat are rendered by hammered intaglione, with delicate shading to show the contours of the head, the zygomatic arches, the horns, the globulous eyes, the nostrils and the gleaming horn of the cloven hooves. The carving is true to life because of the masterly skill of the outline, which delineates the profile supremely well, because of the intaglione, which brings out the inner detail, but also because there is a giraffe foal too, leaning against its mother in a touchingly spontaneous attitude. This vein of observation is also to be found in the fresco at Iheron, where the world of hurrying movement is kept distinct in all its details by impeccable sureness of line. There are 16 giraffes, elegantly intermingled, parties of bison traveling on their pack oxen, and gazelles and antelopes Dorcas, Dama, oryx and hart beast identifiable respectively by their slender horns and white coats, their swept back horns and elongated heads. On the same panel, a newborn giraffe foal, still attached by its umbilical cord, is squatting and struggling to get its balance. A lion with a sheep in its claws is watching armed men who have set out in pursuit of it, whilst other sheep scamper away in terror. The ox is going to a pond to drink, which makes the frogs jump. This is the touching, variegated kaleidoscope of nature, with the king in a role of intruder. However, naturalistic detail never inhibits the bringing out of the essentials of composition by a technique which is rather like a sculptural approach to painting. Thus the principal character is depicted on a larger scale, overshadowing lesser characters who are relatively reduced in size, like the tall masked hunter towering over wild animals, the huge arrow laying his enemies low, or the Oba of Benin shown magnified in relation to his subjects. 680. African prehistoric art. This stress on the essential gives rise to symbolist forms, the antithesis of the Baroque. Combined with a sculptural treatment, it produced the particular rhythms underlying both the bubalus drawn with a crisp, simple line and the herd of oxen at Jagbaran, where we can almost hear the stamping of hooves, the snorting and the lowing cf. Leju illustration. It is everyday popular art, with a sense of humor that expresses the bittersweet ironies of life. It is also esoteric art, vibrating with the mystical fervor that impelled the painter or engraver, and as such it has yielded some of the gems of universal art, like the ram with a solar disk at Boulogne, whose priestly posture is both an annunciation of the mystery and a call to meditation. 39. This dual approach well conveys the two sides of the modern African's makeup, spontaneous and almost casual in ordinary matters, solemn and mystical when caught up in the rhythm of a ritual dance. African prehistoric art is not dead. It lives on, if only in the unchanging place names. For instance, the valley running into the Oudjeret is called Tintade, or place of the she-ass, and there is indeed the fine carving of an ass there. Issabkai Ben Athelia is reputedly haunted by spirits, jinn perhaps because there is a horrifying animal figure, part fowl, part owl, with a colossal sex organ who peers over a pile of votive stones thrown there to propitiate it. Africans are cut off from this art form by distance, a barrier overcome only by scholars and experts from wealthy countries, and it deserves to be reintroduced into their lives, at least through the medium of school syllabuses. It needs to be jealously protected from the various kinds of damage that threaten it daily, for it is a legacy without price. 40. A complete register should be compiled, to facilitate comparative study. Prehistoric art offers many pointers to aspects of the life of early African man, from his physical environment to his loftiest feelings, and the image is sometimes assigned as eloquent as writing. The evidence is, of course, ambiguous, enigmatic, and needs to be supplemented from sources such as paleontology, climatology, archaeology and oral tradition. But, even if it only shows us the tip of an iceberg, we should be justified in regarding prehistoric art as the continent's first history book, or as the projection onto the stone walls of rock shelters of a scenario for living which has long disappeared. It constitutes a monument where African man proclaims his desperate struggle to dominate nature and to attain to the boundless joy of creation and the ecstasy of God knowing him. The end. 39. It is noteworthy that we find mention in the literature of two rams at the court of the Emperor of Mali in the 14th century, to protect the king from the evil eye. Rams have also been reported from other African courts, including Meroe, Bacon Gun at Cuba, Zaire and Kanem, Chad. 40. In 1974 the Algerian government introduced regulations making the whole area of the Taxili paintings and carvings a national park. 681. Plate 26. I detail from the White Lady Cave painting, South Africa. AAA photo, Duverger. Plate 26.2 Serpent's Track Cave painting. AAA photo, Mordoot. /O plate 26.3 Engraving of Rhinoceros, Blade. AA, Niger. H.J. Hugot. Plate 26.4 Engraving of an Elephant. Inikir, Algerian Sahara. H.P.C. Han. Plate 26.5 Bovine, Timber Rose, Mali. H.J. Hugot. Plate 26.6 Gazelles, Blade. AA, Niger. H.J. Hugot. Plate 26.7 Cave Engraving, Upper Volta. J. Davis. 683. Plate 26.8 Close-up of cave engravings, Upper Volta. J. Davis. Plate 26.9 Erotic Scene, Tassili P. Colombo. Plate 26.10 Erotic Scene, Tassili P. Colombo. Plate 26.11 Cave Painting, T.D. Bell Style, Chad Hoa Key. 684. Plate 26.12 Cave Paintings, Tassili AAA Photo, Sugiate, Note. 685. Plate 26.13 Cave Paintings, Namibia AAA Photo, Sudriate, Note. 686. Origins, Development and Expansion of Agricultural Techniques. R. Porters 1 and JBARRAU. Ideas about the origins of agriculture have for a long time been pervaded by some measure of ethnocentricity. The tendency was and sometimes still is to think that a Neolithic revolution, as defined by Gordon Childe, occurred in an agricultural and pastoral cradle in the Near East, and that this was not simply the birthplace for the cultivation of major cereals like wheat and barley and of animal husbandry, goats, sheep and later cattle, which are the very foundation of Western material civilization, but also the genesis of civilization itself, at any rate so far as the Old World was concerned. It is no doubt true that archaeological research after the Second World War and especially during the last 20 years has to some extent modified this narrow and somewhat self-centered point of view. Recent research has confirmed the importance of the Fertile Crescent in the history of world agriculture. 3. But it has also thrown light on a role of other regions in this major change in the life of man, the change to the production of foodstuffs which previously had been merely collected from the natural environment. The result has been a clearer appreciation of the significance of agricultural inventions and plant domestication in America and of the relatively earlier development of a cradle of agriculture in tropical South. I note by Jacques Barrow, Roland Porters, professor at the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle de Paris, died on March 28, 1974. Entrusted by the International Scientific Committee for the directing of a general history of Africa with preparing this chapter on the origins and development of agricultural techniques. He had worked out an outline, but this was one of his last tasks. Taking this unfinished work of his and basing myself on his many published works, on his notes and on the numerous discussions that I had had with him on this subject, I have endeavored to complete the task while remaining faithful to Porters's passionate interest in the fascinating character of Africa, of its regions, its peoples and its civilizations. While acknowledging its imperfections, I offer this contribution to his work as a tribute to the teacher and the friend who has done so much for a better understanding of the agriculture and the cultivated plants of the African continent. 2. V.G. Child, 1954. 3. C. For example, R.J. Braidwood, I. 960. 4. C. For example, R.S. McNeish, 1964. 1. Methodology and African Prehistory. East Asia 5 and, lastly, of the contribution of Africa to the history of world agriculture. Already, however, nearly half a century ago, the celebrated Russian agronomist and geneticist N. Vavilov posited the existence of centers in Africa where cultivated plants could have originated, and later one of his assistants, A. Kutsov, 7 demonstrated that such centers had, in fact, existed. A few years later, one of the authors of this chapter plotted in detail the situation and number of these centers of origin and described their role. 8. However, colonialist prejudices lied to ignorance about many African cultigens and, generally, about the prehistory of the continent, led to a long period when the participation of Africa in developing agricultural techniques and resources was either played down or disregarded altogether. This situation has radically changed, and the last few years have seen the growth of a keen interest in the origins of African agriculture. Witness, for example, the essays published in 1968 in Current Anthropology 9 and the large number of comments that they aroused. We must also mention the studies put together by J.D. Fitch and R. A. Oliver Ten and, still more recently, the contribution of W. G. L. Randys to the history of Bantu civilization. But before attempting a brief account of the state of our knowledge of the agricultural prehistory of Africa, we must describe the ecological setting into which it fitted. Natural environments and the origins of African agriculture. It is obvious that the origins, development and diversity of agricultural techniques must be closely related to aspects of the natural environment such as the climate, the water resources, the geographical relief, the nature of the soil and of the vegetation, the types of plants originally utilized, and the nature of foodstuffs they yielded, and so on. However, these elements, important and even predominant as they are in the raising of plants and stock, were not the sole agencies at work. There was also the influence of the prevailing cultures and civilizations. Even in pre-agricultural times and when agriculture was just beginning, MN had carried with him in his migrations implements, techniques, modes of understanding and interpreting the environment, and methods of 5. C.J. Barrow, 1975. 6. N. Vavilov, 1951, pages 1 to 6. 7. Cited by C. D. Darlington, 1963. 8. R. Porters, 1962. 9. O. Davies, The Origins of Agriculture in West Africa. H. J. Hugot, The Origins of Agriculture, Sahara. D. Sutton, The Origins and Development of Agriculture in East and Southern Africa. 10. 1970. 11. 1974. 688. Origins, Development and Expansion of Agricultural Techniques Manipulating and Using Space. He also took with him the whole range of attitudes and of behavior that had grown out of his relationships with nature in his original habitat. Thus, at a time when Europe was barely emerging from the Paleolithic, the cultivation of plants and the raising of livestock were already established in the Near East, where the first cities were beginning to appear, and it was the Near East which introduced to a somewhat backward Europe those technical inventions which, with their attendant attitudes, made possible there also a Neolithic revolution based on agriculture and stock breeding. Similar migrations or exchanges took place in Africa, as elsewhere, as a result of population movements within Africa and between neighboring continents. It is essential, however, to grasp the implications both of the inventions of agriculture and stock herding and of the domestication of plants and animals. MN passed from mere food collecting, gathering, hunting to artificially producing, cultivating, rearing. Thus, progressively and partially, MN began to free himself from the constraints of the ecosystems to which he belonged and in which, until he began to control agriculture and stock raising, he led more or less the same passive or biocenotic life as other living organisms following the normal course of natural processes. Thus the introduction of agriculture and stock raising was a fundamental change which permitted human beings to adapt to various natural environments and made it possible to change biological processes in order to produce more or something different from what they would have done by themselves. Man's new role of cultivator and stock breeder also caused very considerable changes in the natural environment as well as in quantity and quality of the food produced. Nevertheless, in spite of his mastery over some elements of his natural environment, man was not able to free himself totally and immediately from all the constraints they imposed. We must therefore consider the environmental features which played an overriding role in agricultural prehistory and history in Africa, and so we need to sketch an environmental map of the continent. We find that it is divided into wide latitudinal bands which are ecologically distinct from each other and which lie symmetrically north and south of the equator. As was pointed out by Randy's 1974, some of these bands acted as barriers to north-south migrations. The HE barriers were the Sahara, the Great Equatorial Rainforest, the Tanzanian Steppe and the Kalahari Desert. But other bands provided spaces, or convenient pockets, into which these currents or population movements could flow, for example, the northern and southern savannas. Randy's, however, also pointed out that none of the barriers were absolutely impenetrable. The Sahara and the Great Equatorial Forest, for example, contain obvious evidence of some migration of peoples. Latitude is not the sole factor roughly marking off the major ecological zones of Africa. Geographical relief and so also altitude enter into the picture. 689. Methodology and African prehistory. / principle. Corridor of diffusion. Mediterranean and similar southern climate zones. : V/J desert or Semil desert. Circumflex accent W savanna or steppe. Ethiopian highlands. Forest. Figure 27.1 Latitudinal zoning of the African continent. As well, witness the zodiacal axis which separates the East African highlands from the West African peneplain, while the latter itself is bisected by a minor axis of a thrust between Principe Island and Chad. There are therefore exceptions to this latitudinal zoning of the African continent, the most important of which is perhaps that of the highlands already mentioned, extending, parallel to the Rift Valley, from the north of Lake Victoria to the Munjinga Hills, and which, to cite Randy's again, acted as a narrow and safe corridor through the equatorial barrier. Figure 27.1. There is also the Ethiopian Massif, a role of which in the origin of African cultivated plants will be described later. If at this stage we put together the various elements of the picture, extremely summary though they may be, we can see Africa as consisting of an almost semicircular zone of savanna and steppe in the north, the east and the south enclosing the core of equatorial forest, and then, still further north and south, two arid zones, the Sahara and the Kalahari, and lastly, to furthest north and furthest south, two narrow almost homoclimatic zones which, to simplify a great deal, could both be described as Mediterranean in climate, even though there are certain ecological. 690. Origins, development and expansion of agricultural techniques. Desert or Semil desert. Savanna or steppe. Circumflex accent tropical forest. Mediterranean or similar vegetation. Figure 27.2 Ecosystems of the African continent. Peculiarities to be found in the extreme south of Africa. Figure 27.2. Moving outwards, then, from the equatorial forest heart of Africa and leaving beside the coastal regions, we can draw a graph from the extremely humid to the extremely dry, from the generalized ecosystems of the tropical rainforest type to the more specialized ecosystems of the savanna, steppe and desert. Scrub types. 12 With regard to deserts, and more specifically the Sahara, it may at this point be recalled, even though it is now a sufficiently well-known fact, that it was not always the desert that it is now. Agriculture and stock raising were carried on there, and a number of writers 13 have suggested that cradles of agriculture and animal husbandry are to be found in the Sahara. Returning, however, to our ecological map of Africa, we can assume that in pre-agricultural times food gathering and hunting similar to those still used today by the pygmies were practiced in the generalized ecosystem of the great tropical rainforest, whose food resources, both animal and 12. For the terms specialized ecosystems and generalized ecosystems, C. D. Harris, 1969. 13. A. Chevalier, 1938, H. J. Hugot, 1968, J. J. Hester, 1968. 691. Methodology and African prehistory. Vegetables are as varied and abundant as the constituents of their biosynosis. Given the food resources available to pygmy bands and the density of population in the forests, it is clear that they can obtain the food they need without undue effort or anxiety. The same is true of the hunter-gatherers in the more specialized ecosystem of arid and subarid regions, for example, the Kung sand of the Kalahari studied by J. B. Lee. 14. For these people the food available is less varied and, because of wide seasonal variations in rainfall, tends to be restricted to areas near water supplies. Returning to Africa's pre-agricultural past, we may note that the humid phase known as the Macaline 5500 to 2500 before our era, which followed the Pleistocene, made contacts rather easier between the Mediterranean coast and the regions south of the Sahara, while the increase in the level of water courses and lakes, even in the heart of the continent, helped fishing to develop and brought some degree of settlement among the populations which resorted to it. Both of these conditions favored a gradual transition to agriculture. 15. Migrations from the Near Eastern and Mediterranean cradles of agriculture which took place at this time no doubt accelerated the process. 16. From the end of the Pleistocene, that is, between 9000 before our era and the beginning of the Macaline, there seem to have been some places where the kind of food suitable for gathering grew in great abundance, and this doubtless encouraged early man to concentrate in them. The HE forest savanna borderland on the edges of the equatorial forest, the East African grassland plateaus, the waterside of lakes and major rivers, such as the Nile, as well as the coastal regions of the north and south come into this category. 17. These transitional zones, and especially the forest savanna borderland, possessed all the characteristics required for agricultural development and, much later, not surprisingly, for the growth of a number of African civilizations. Randi's remarks in this connection that it is at the margins of the two savanna Sahel and forest fringes that are to be found the most prestigious of the Bantu civilizations. We should now consider in some detail the possibilities for plant domestication that were available in Africa, for we must not forget that in the logic of ecology it is the plants which are the primary producers. The African origin of some cultivated plants, it is only comparatively recently that interest has been focused on the origin. 14. R. Beale, 1966. 15. For the relationship between the sedentarization of fishing communities and the origins of agriculture, C.C. O. Sauer, 1952. 16. C.J.D. Clark, 1970b. 17. Hibbett, 692. Origins, Development and Expansion of Agricultural Techniques of Cultivated Plants. If the remarkable work by A. D. Kondal, published in 1883, is accepted, it is only with the work of the Soviet geneticist N. I. Vavilov and his team beginning work soon after the October Revolution in 1917 that a global approach was made to this question of fundamental importance in the history of man, and that man's attempts to use his environment and its resources were studied. 18. Vavilov's point of departure was the variations observed in cultivated plants, and, by combining the systematic analysis of botanical and phytogeographical data with agribotanical inventories and genetic studies, he and his assistants were able to point to 8 regions where cultivated plants first emerged. These 8 regions included 3 secondary centers, of more local importance. Only one of the main centers, the Abyssinian, is situated in Africa, though another, the Mediterranean, affects part of the African continent, North Africa and Egypt, and also shows affinities with the vastly important Near Eastern center of origin where, as we have already said, the major cereals wheat, barleys, rice appeared in addition to other cultivated plants. With regard to Africa, Vavilov's conclusions represent a considerable change from those of Kondal, who recognized only 3 primary centers of origin for agriculture and the domestication of plants: China, Southeast Asia with an extension to Egypt and America. Vavilov's contribution to the understanding of the theory of the origin of cultivated plants was also of the highest importance, because he established the need to distinguish between a center of primary mutation, where a very great diversity in any particular plant is combined with continuing dominant characteristics, and, on the other hand, sub-areas of secondary mutation which show many recessive characteristics which were masked in the center of primary mutation. WHEN centers of mutation are found closely associated in the same area. They are said jointly to constitute a cradle of agriculture, and its existence is usually an indication that a civilization has been at work for a long time, altering and domesticating the plants required by that society. It is important to stress the point that the botanical place of origin of a cultivated plant species is not necessarily the same as the area in which it was first adapted by human intervention for man's own use. So, One often has to distinguish between the place of origin of the wild parent of a cultivated species and the place where the plant emerged in an altered form after being domesticated and subjected to selection by man. This last has a simple explanation. In the long years of plant gathering, the wild parent must have been frequently carried away from its original habitat. 19 Handy of the present authors has been able to complete Vavilov's 20 picture by demonstrating that in addition to the Abyssinian center and the African portion of the Mediterranean center, there existed also a West African 18. For the enormous work of N. I. Vavilov, C.O. Pasit, 1951. 19. C. J. Barrow, 1962. 20. C. R. Porters, 1950, 1951 8. 693. Methodology and African Prehistory. Center and an East African one, this latter being possibly an extension into the equatorial highlands of the Abyssinian center. 21. W.E. can summarize the situation as follows. The Mediterranean center. The African portion of this center includes the group of cultivated plants and OW characteristic of Mediterranean regions, such as cereals, especially wheats and barleys, and leguminous plants with edible seeds (cicer, plans, pisum, vc, which were also developed in the Near Eastern center. We also find here COMMON Mediterranean cultivated species such as the olive tree Olea Europa L and the carrot or Mediterranean locust trees Ceratonia siliqua L. However, some of the plants are proper to Africa, like the argan tree Argonia sidoxylon M. From Morocco, which yields oil and gum. Egypt, whose links with the Near East obvious and whose influence in agriculture and stock breeding in North Africa is so important, belongs to this center. In Egypt, and also Syria, the berseem or Alexandrian clover Trifolium alexandrinum L was developed and proved of great economic importance. Although this African portion of the Mediterranean center did not play a direct part in the development of agriculture in tropical Africa, it did profoundly influence the Sahara during the period when the climate there was favorable to cultivation and stock raising. 22. The Abyssinian center has, in the cultivated species it produced, affinities with the Near East center wheats, bars, leguminous plants like cicer, plans, pisum, vicia, and also with some found in African centers proper such as sorghum, which will be dealt with later. It seems evident that plants originating in Asia passed into Africa through this center. However, this Abyssinian center also developed some characteristic cultivated species, among them the Arabian coffee shrub Coffea arabica L, the Abyssinian banana tree Musa onctate, IFG melon natif grass Iragrostis abyssinica shrub, and the Niger oleaginous seeds Gizolcia abyssinica, LF cas. The East African center is characterized by a number of varieties of sorghum including sorghum verticilliflorum staph, and various penicilliumillets such as the Halusan Koracnuger 10, and various sesames. The West African center. Here we find the origin of various types of sorghum deriving from sorghum runtinosium staph, of penicilliumillet like Panicetium pycnostachium staph, and HUBB, and P. gambitans staph, and hub, as well as digitary millets including Iberidigitaria iberistaph, and Phonio dx like staph, and several rice varieties which will be referred to below. 23. In this center we can distinguish two main ranges of development, the tropical and the sub-equatorial. Within the tropical range there are several subdivisions: the Senegambian, the Central Niger, the Chad Nilotic, each of them producing characteristic cultivated plants, principally cereals but some tuberous coleus chef, especially and some oleaginous such to I. Cr. Schnell, 1957. 22. C.J.D. Clark, 1970 B. and H. J. Hugot, 1968. 23. C.R. Porters, 1962. 694. Origins, Development and Expansion of Agricultural Techniques. As Butrospermum parcaephedon. Kotschi known to botanists also as Vitellaria paradoxa Gertner. T.O. The sub-equatorial range belonged especially the yams Bioscoria kinensis Mk. D. Demitorum pax. D. Rotundata Poiler. Oleaginous plants Philly Gibnensis Jacques, Telferia accidentalis Hook, F. and stimulants Cola nitida. Chef. This center actually extends itself into Central Africa, as do the areas of diffusion of certain kinds of plants mentioned above: cola, coleus, ileis. The earth pa or bombera groundnut Diosynthesia subterraneous on, and the leguminous African geocarp Christangella geocarpid harms, also originated in the West African center. In the view of the present authors, there originally existed to the immediate east and south of the equatorial forest a belt with a complex of cultivated species similar to the one found in the West African center and which roughly followed contours of the forest belt, skirting in the process the East African center and thus practically coextensive with the intensive gathering zone of the forest perimeter described above. 20 For all these considerations lead 25 us to suppose that a number of cradles of agriculture existed in Africa, which we can list as follows. Figure 27.31 The Afro-Mediterranean cradle, stretching from Egypt to Morocco, which influenced the development of agriculture and pastoralism in the Sahara and which also acted as a channel of exchange with the Near Eastern cradle through Egypt. 2a The West African cradle, with its tropical and sub-equatorial sectors. b The Nile-Abyssinian cradle in the east, with two sectors, the Nilotic and the Abyssinian. 3 The Central African cradle. For the East African cradle to the east of the Central African cradle and extending west to Angola. Further to the south, it appears that food gatherers, doubtless provided with adequate resources, but also protected by the aridity of the Kalahari, managed for a long time to resist the penetration of agriculture and pastoralism from the cradles described above and, more particularly, from the East African cradle. 26 The concept of cradles of agriculture has the disadvantage of suggesting that the prehistory and history of agricultural development proceeded in a patchwork pattern. However, in the light of what has already been said, we think it possible to present a more coherent general picture. In the central core of forest, there was a generalized ecosystem out of which was developed a center of horticulture, a term which we think preferable to the unsatisfactory term center of viticulture proposed by 24. C.D. Seddon, 1968. 25. C.R. Porters, 1962. 26. C.D. Seddon, 1968. 695. Methodology and African Prehistory. Ti.1% I. 1 Mediterranean African, 2 West African, 3 Nilotic Abyssinian, 4 Central African, 5 East African. W. //11. Figure 27.3 Cradles of African Agriculture. R. J. Braidwood, N.C. 8. Read to 7. But in the forest conditions, gathering was still sufficiently productive to allow this to continue. It should be noted that the range of plants from this center which could usefully be domesticated was less wide than the range found in the wet tropical forest centers of Asia or America. Secondly, there was the savanna around forest fringes providing a more specialized ecosystem which became an agricultural center for the cultivation of cereals, and which extended from west to East Africa and south towards Angola. In North Africa along the Mediterranean the cultivation of cereal spread from Mesopotamia through Egypt. It also penetrated into the Sahara at a time when conditions were suitable, and this fact goes a long way towards explaining some diffusions towards the south of the present desert as well as others in the opposite direction from sub-Saharan Africa. The influence of Mesopotamia can also be seen in the Ethiopian highlands, which however also share some affinities with the agricultural center of the savannas and steppes as well as possessing their own cultigenous characteristics. A horticultural center differs from a center of agriculture in the 27. R. J. Braidwood, N.C. 8. Reed, 1957. 696. Origins, Development and Expansion of Agricultural Techniques. Preponderance of tuberous plants, and in the method of cultivation which belongs rather to the garden orchard, the hortus of the forest and its borders than to the field, the acre of the savanna and the steppe. In the African continent as a whole, agricultural implements consisted principally of the hoe and the digging stick, with their variations, but a primitive plough introduced through Egypt and Ethiopia made an inroad into part of the center of cereal cultivation. The cultivation of sorghum and rice in contrast to the horticultural center of the generalized ecosystem of the forest belt, the African agricultural center, within the relatively specialized ecosystem of savanna and steppe, is characterized first by the use of cultivated plants reproduced by the sowing of seeds and secondly, by the importance of cereals in the food complex of the population. Agricultural systems of this kind cultivated plants en masse as distinct from the cultivation of single plants that is characteristic of the horticulture found in the forest belt. The agricultural civilizations no doubt extended their cultivated fields at the expense of the forest as they came into contact with it in the course of their territorial expansion, and this tended to increase the extent of the savanna. In ecological terms, these civilizations imposed some degree of specialization on ecosystems that were originally generalized in their nature, and in this way subjected the natural environment to their techniques, or rather to their conception of what the environment should be. But there were failures as well as successes in this penetration of agriculture into the forest milieu. For example, cereals might have been abandoned in favor of food crops which were more characteristic of the forests, and even, the possibility cannot be ruled out, the adoption of plant gathering as the means of subsistence by savanna peoples, normally agriculturists, who had been obliged to take to life in a forest environment. The fact, however, remains that the cultivation of cereals is the main characteristic of steppe and savanna agriculture. The mongme cereals, one in particular, sorghum spp, or great millet, appears as the characteristic cultigen throughout the area of this agricultural center, though other varieties of different origin are also found. The origin of the various varieties of sorghum was for a long time the subject of conflicting views. 28 But it seems that the cereal sorghums did indeed originate in Africa, and that in fact they did have a number of independent points of origin within the African agricultural center. The wild variety sorghum Runtenaceum staff, which originated in the wet tropical zone running from Cape Verde to the Indian Ocean, gave rise to the group of sorghums cultivated in West Africa. S. Aterigmum staff, S. nitens snowed, S. Drummond by Millsp. and Chase, S. Margaritiferum staff, S. 28. Cr. Porters, 1962. 697. Methodology and African Prehistory. Guineans staff, S. Gampicum snowed, S. excertum snowed. The wild variety S. verticilliflorum staff, which originated in the area of East Africa from Eritrea to Southeast Africa, gave rise to two groups of cultivated sorghums, the Southeast African or the Kaffir sorghums, S. Kaffirem bovi, S. coriaceum snowed, S. dulcical sweet sorghum, and the Chabdile type usually found from the Nigerian Sudan to Eritrea, S. nigricans snowed, and S. caudadium staff. The wild variety S. Ethiopicum rupture, which originated in Eritrea and Ethiopia, gave rise to 5. Rigidium snowed, found on the Blue Nile, S. staff, cultivated from Chad to India and in all semi desert types of country, S. Surnum host, S. subglabrescens schw, and ash, found in the Nilotic regions, and S. nigricum cultivated in the central Nigerian delta. In the central river Niger sector of the tropical section of the West African cradle, a special cultivated sorghum, S. mellitum snowed, var. mellitum snowed, is used for making an alcoholic drink 29 because of its rich sugar content. Other sorghums are also used for making millet beer. There are cross relations between these various groups of cultivated sorghums, as is witnessed by the existence of S. conspicuum snowed, found from Tanganyika to Zimbabwe and Angola, and S. oxburghii staff, found in Uganda, Kenya, Zimbabwe and South Africa, which seem to have arisen from crossing between sorghums, some of which were related to S. runtenaceum and others to S. verticilliflorum. Of these sorghums, 5. Thura deserves to be noted because of its distribution over the whole area from the eastern Sudan to Asia Minor and India, and from Mesopotamia to Iran and Gujarat. Enough has been said to indicate the importance of these cereals in the plant economy of the agricultural center of the African savannas and steppes of Africa. Moreover, this importance transcends the limits of the continent, since some types of sorghum domesticated here spread very early to other regions of the world. So it would seem better to see Africa as having both a number of cradles of agriculture and a mosaic of centers where cultivated plants originated, some of which became of economic importance on a global scale. Africa was the source of other cultivated species, not least rice, which was developed from indigenous varieties. These varieties were found in the West African cradle and, more precisely, in the central river Niger sector, a center of primary variation, and in the Senegambian sector, a secondary center. In classical times, Strabo had referred to the cultivation of rice in Africa, and in the 14th century Ibn Battuta mentioned that rice was produced on the Niger. 30. But this evidence was often ignored, and it was for a long time believed that rice cultivation in Africa began with the introduction of Asian rice or It was only about 1914 that the existence 29. Cr. Schnell, 1957. 30. Hibbett,